I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to hand over to Terry. Terry, take it away.
Thank you, Alison, and thanks so much for the opportunity to have a chat tonight, and for all of you giving up your time to participate. I was just saying in the virtual room before we started to Alison that very valuable for me to be in discussions like this, because it'd be helpful if I unmuted, would it? Thank you, Alison. I was just saying thank you so much for giving up your time to come along tonight, and also for inviting me. It's very valuable for me. I was just saying beforehand in the virtual room before we started to Alison and colleagues that like anybody in an organisation, you spend most of your time dealing with the main other organisations you deal with. So I spend a lot of time working with the businesses we regulate. I spend a lot of time talking to local authorities about flooding issues. I spend a lot of time talking to communities, but it'll tend to be community members who are living around sites that have pollution problems, etc. It's not very often, or not often enough, I get to be in general discussions like this, and I always, I think better about SEPA's role and what we should do after these discussions. I just want to describe One Planet Prosperity and where it's come from, and then what are the challenges in delivering it. So One Planet Prosperity is based on the Ecological Footprint concept. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that. So it's invented by Mathis Wackenagel and Bill Rees. So Mathis is a Swiss guy who was doing his PhD at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and Bill was his PhD supervisor. And the history of environmental management is we have measured and tried to reduce lots of very specific environmental issues. So there are people in SEPA and EPAs and universities and other places around the world who have been for years and years measuring phosphorus in a river, for example. The metrics about the overall planet are still relatively new. So we're bombarded, as we should be, about climate change data and the ppm and what degrees warming will get, et cetera, et cetera. But these measures of overall environmental impact are pretty recent, and the ecological footprint was one of the very first. And it's a pretty simple concept. So if everyone in the world lived like people in the UK, we would need 3 planets. And it's pretty obvious we've only got one. So when you think about that simple fact, and Mathis will say, you know, it's taking all economic and social activity that happens in the UK and then trying to assess how much it's using the planet. So it might be 3.2, it might be 2.8. It's not the most precise science, but it's not 1.1 and it's not 8. So it gives us a very clear indication of what's the scale of the challenge facing us. And as I say to business people, if your business last year, your costs were 3 times your revenue, and the year before it was the same, and the year before that it was the same, and it's predicted to be 3.1 next year, you wouldn't sit around and say, gee, we better have a 3% increase in sales or a 4% cut in costs. You'd say, this is existential. You'd have a crisis process about, we need to radically change or our business won't survive. Well, that's what 3 to 1 means for the planet and our lifestyles. Now, overall, humanity is about 1.6 to 1. So Earth Overshoot Day was August the 22nd this year. It was July the 29th last year. It's gone in the wrong direction every year, bar 2. There was one year, I can't remember when it was, in the 70s or 80s, where it just moved back in the right direction slightly. And this year it's gone in the right direction for about 3 or 4 weeks because of the wrong reason. It's because of the pandemic and the interruption to economic activity. And as Mathis says, so in this decade, we will either end up, because we've really got a decade to radically change things, with a future for humanity which is one of one planet prosperity or is one of one planet misery. And the fact that you're involved in this group and that you're on the call, you are part of society that recognises that more than most. So that's the simple rationale and reasoning. So then what does it mean for SEPA? What, you know, most, certainly OECD countries have an EPA or something like it. You know, England calls it the Environment Agency. Wales calls it Natural Resources Wales. I was in Northern Ireland running their Environment Agency for just over 2 years. But there's a function like an EPA in certainly most OECD countries and in fact in many other countries now. And the first one was Sweden in 67, the second one was the US EPA in 69, and the third one was the state of Victoria in Australia, where I'm from, which was 1970. And the reason that Victoria set up the third EPA in the world's history was Melbourne and Geelong, which is the second city, were really the industrial heartland of Australia and to some degree Southeast Asia, because when this happened and, you know, developed in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, Southeast Asia was still, you know, quite largely an agrarian society. And the reason that Melbourne became the manufacturing base for Australia was because it has, I think it's something like about 500 years of coal, and it's not black coal, it's brown coal, it's the dirtiest coal. So simply by having this massive source of, at the time, what was thought was certainly cheap and what was thought of as being harmless energy source, Melbourne became the industrial centre. So if you go back to the sort of history of environmental management, in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, Melbourne was colloquially known as Smelbourne because it exploded in size because of, I think, the second biggest gold rush in the world's history after California. North of Melbourne, but that meant Melbourne went from a village to a city of a couple 100,000 people in a very short period. And so the Yarra River, which is the main river in the city, became polluted and the rich people lived in the middle of the city. So environmental management in the late 1800s was, we won't clean up the pollution, we'll have the same level of pollution, but we'll move the factories to the second river, the Maribyrnong River, because that's where the workers live. So they can live with the pollution. And the Maribyrnong River was one of the reasons Victoria had the third EPA in the world, because the river used to catch on fire. It had so much pollution in it. So there was this huge industrial area. Now, when I was a kid, so I was 6 when the Victorian EPA was set up, I lived in that area. I was probably 6 or 7 miles from there, but I was that side of the city. You pretended you didn't live near that river because it was embarrassing. If you go back today, that side of Melbourne, Melbourne's a city of 5 million people. That side of the city has 2 million people. The 2 streets either side of that river have the most expensive real estate on that side of the city where 2 million people live. Because the EPA, along with the businesses and the communities and the councils, etc., massively cleaned up that river. And the same stories exist in all industrial societies. You know, you can tell the same stories about the Clyde. Like the Maribyrnong River is still to some degree polluted, but it's massively cleaner. The Clyde is still to some degrees polluted, but it's massively cleaner. You can go through all parts of Scotland, particularly the Central Belt, and talk about the environmental improvements, not just coming from SEPA, but coming from businesses, communities, councils, and the effort that we put in. This turns to the challenge for SEPA. So if I give you a very practical example, we spend probably about 1/3 of our budget on implementing the European Water Framework Directive. So that's the directive which says water quality in rivers and locks and the marine environment needs to be X, Y, Z. And we spend a lot of money monitoring. We then take the monitoring data and we say there's BOD is too high, so what are the sources of pollution that create that? And then we have programs to go and regulate the businesses, maybe stop runoff from farms, etc. Now you think if we were absolutely brilliant at that and we stopped all pollution into all rivers and locks in Scotland and out into the marine environment, and we have 2 or 3 degrees warming, what will happen to all those water bodies? So we could do the most brilliant job at what I call the phase 1 of EPAs, where we dealt with these traditional pollution sources, where we basically stopped local pollution, the bread and butter of an EPA. If we just do that, but we don't make a contribution to biodiversity collapse and climate change, it doesn't matter what we do in stopping pollution, the Scottish environment will be massively damaged and will ultimately collapse in terms of supporting our way of life. Now, at this point, it's really important for me to say a couple of things. So I talk to our staff and I say it is not that we have to reduce our effort to stop those traditional pollution issues. We actually have to do them quicker and be better at them. So we're not going to rock up to, 10 people living near a stinking landfill and say, look, this is really awful for you. It blights your lives. It's terrible. But could you just close your windows for 5 years and put up with it? Because, we've got to tackle climate change. Of course, we're not going to do that. But we can't just fix the odour because, again, what will life be like for those people if we fix the odour from the landfill, but we have 3 degrees warming? They won't have enjoyable lives at all. So the first key message for me is for us to deliver One Planet prosperity, we need to do what we've always done, which is fix industrial pollution, stop runoff from farms, all those things that EPAs traditionally do. And we have to make our own contribution to tackling the big environmental issues: climate change, biodiversity collapse, the oceans full of marine plastics, etc. So the challenge in delivering that, there are many. First thing we have to do is recognise that we are one of many players. So if Scotland is to decarbonise and to dematerialise its economy, that will take effort from every single citizen, every single business, every single government agency, every single local authority, every single third sector organisation. Because what we're now talking about, and again, you're an audience, I'm talking to the converted, we have to fundamentally change our economies and societies. So if Mathis and his team in California said, we've measured and the UK and Scotland are at 1.1 planets, well then what SEPA should do is just put all its effort into that traditional phase 1 work, fixing the next bit of local pollution or making sure the next contaminated site is cleaned up. Because that would mean that our economy and society, if we're at 1.1, is a bit over, but is largely in sync with what the planet can sustain. But it's not, it's at 3. So the task for us is that change. So let me give you a couple of examples of what we're doing. Some of this, depending on what your life experience is and your work experience is, you'll probably think, doesn't an EPA do this already? But there are things that are in the DNA of regulatory agencies, including EPAs around the world, that are pretty common. So the first thing is we have set what we call sector plans. So we regulate 33 different sectors of the economy. And it's not like we haven't planned our work in the past, but EPAs tend to construct their work programs, deploy their resources to administer processes. It tends to be what regulators do. So we would have a program of inspections of, let's take whiskey distilleries, and we would deal with them individually. Now, that's actually the most compliant sector with Scotland's environment protection laws. It was 94% the last year we measured. In the sector plan, what we've done is we've said, what are the compliance issues for this sector? So they're 94%. They've still got a couple of things that some of them need to fix. But what we're measuring is what happens at the distillery. Now, the environmental impact from the distillery will probably be 10% or less of the environmental impact of whiskey production and consumption. So we don't regulate the production of the bottles that they put the whiskey in because they're produced somewhere else, they're transported into the distillery. What we're regulating is the discharges from the distillery. Now, whiskey, because it's a premium product, it's heavy glass because they need to make it very attractive, etc. So you then use a lot of energy in making the whiskey bottle. They export a huge amount. So you imagine the energy that's used to export heavy whiskey bottles to the country I come from at the bottom of the planet. There's a huge amount. So in the sector plan, we say, what are the compliance issues? In the whiskey sector, there's not too many because they're at 94%. We have other sectors where we have very significant compliance issues. And then we have some sectors that might be compliant, but we've got, you know, 1 or 2 sites that have big problems. The most high profile one is the Exxon Shell joint facility at Mossmoran, where we have significant problems with flaring. So in the whisky sector plan, we also identify what are the beyond compliance opportunities that we can partner with the industry on and other players. So I'll give you a couple of examples. It's very easy for the whisky industry to reduce the environmental impact of their bottles. They can make them out of unattractive, unappealing, lighter weight glass. And it would reduce their impact a lot because they probably wouldn't sell very much. So the challenge for any business is you can't ignore the one planet, like that's a fact. So how do we work with that sector to say, how could you lightweight the bottles in a way that they retain their market attractiveness, if that's part of what gives you your sales? At a similar level, people in Australia find it funny when I go back and I say, look, one of the issues we're dealing with is drought, because they view Scotland as being a rather wet country and having an abundance of water, whereas Australia, you know, is about 75% arid, and even the bits that are non-arid, we have quite severe droughts. And I say, no, it's a big problem in particular parts of Scotland. And so, you know, with the barley growers and the whisky distillers, they both rely on access to a certain amount of good quality water as inputs. Well, we regulate both sectors. If we take the traditional, what I call phase 1 approach, we just go to each distillery and each farmer and we try and manage their environmental impact. In the sector plan, we can identify that if they can both find ways to use less water, the barley growers in producing barley and the distillers in the direct production of whisky, they will reduce their risks, their business risks, because we're going to have more droughts because of climate change. So the less water they use, the more resilient they'll be in terms of their production, and we'll have the environmental gains. Now, the alternative is if we can't help the users in drought-prone catchments reduce their water use, we will have no choice but to reduce water abstraction rights, because we need to protect the rivers and lochs of that area. So a lot of this is, this phase 2 way of working is trying to use things like our sector plan to take a much more strategic approach to saying, what are the compliance problems? Where are people in these sectors not meeting the law? And what do we do to help them get there? And that help can be everything from, we might advise them, we might get together in partnership, as I just said, with other related sectors or with local communities, or if the help they need is a real kick in the backside because they've broken the law, they won't do anything about it, then we need to wield the big regulatory stick, and we need to get better at doing that faster and more powerfully. Because what we're going to find, and we're already finding this as the effects of climate change are kicking in, people will step up or not step up. And a phase 2 regulator, in my view, needs to be much better at getting the people who are not stepping up and changing their environmental performance to do it. And as I say, we help, but if you don't want to take the friendly help, then you'll have to take the unpleasant help. And we need to do that. And then we need to help those who are trying to innovate and are trying to find a different way to do their business or a different way to conduct their economic or social activity. So to turn to a couple of other things just before I finish and we open up for questions and discussions. There's also, I think, much more innovation right through our system. So we have a reasonably new tool called enforcement undertakings, where if a business says, and I'm talking about business because we mainly regulate businesses. We do regulate councils with landfills and a few others, but most of the people we regulate are running a commercial business. They say, look, we have breached Scotland's environment protection laws. Rather than going through this full process, we put our hand up, we did the wrong thing, we will fix it, make sure it doesn't happen again, and we will spend some of our money helping community groups in the area affected by the pollution to do certain things. So the highest one we've had is £272,000, I think it was. It's a couple of years ago, so I might have that figure slightly wrong, and I think it was for 9 different groups in the Aberdeen area from the major road construction where they had a major, they had several pollution water runoff incidents, and they had a really major one, which some of you may recall. So they were held to account for that. They were made to fix what they were doing, and they were made to spend around about, as I say, £272,000 to go back to community groups to do things that benefited the community and the environment. So that's still using enforcement, but it's trying to use it in a more creative way that you get more benefit to the community and the environment. At the other end of the scale, we have a new tool called Sustainable Growth Agreements. And the idea here is they're just voluntary agreements. We can enter them with one or many organisations. And I'll finish by just talking about two organisations, or the first one and one of the more recent ones. The first one was with a company called Superglass, which is a insulation manufacturer in Stirling, which is where SEPA's head office is. And it was for many years, it had been a really bad business, lost money, was breaching our laws, was, I think, breaching some of the health and safety laws. Again, the factory used to catch on fire, not irregularly. And completely new management came in. And it was before I got to SEPA that our officer who regulated the site and the health and safety executive officer said to the new management team, look, this is just terrible. You've got to fix this or we'll have to close you down. The new management, really good. They said, give us a list of priorities. They worked through them. They started fixing them. They invested in the plant till the plant was just about fully compliant. And we talked to them about their managing director, who's ex-McKinsey. He's a very hard-nosed business person. He's a good business person to deal with. He said, because of the environmental improvements we've made, as long as with all the other improvements we've made, the environment is becoming the golden thread upon which all of our expansion depends on. So they, last year, I think, had a £45 million foreign investment. The First Minister turned on the investment was made, doubling of production. First Minister turned it on. I was there for the ceremony. And what's great about that is they take glass, which might end up being landfilled, and they turn it into insulation. And the insulation goes into buildings, which reduces energy use. So it's a circular economy positive story. And the Sustainable Growth Agreement said, you must keep complying with all the laws and we will help you go further. So they've set beyond compliance targets in reducing carbon, reducing materials use, reducing water. They partly win overseas sales based on their environmental performance. And again, an important thing here is in this phase 2 way of working. At the launch, I spoke for about 4 minutes. And one of the things I said was I turned to the managing director after extolling the virtues of what they'd done for the couple of years since the takeover. I said, now, Ken, I know you're sitting here thinking SEPA's going to partner with us and shake our hand and help us out. That's all great, but you're worried that if you ever have a big pollution incident, SEPA's traditional services won't be available to you. And I can put your mind at ease. If, despite however good you are for several years, you have slipped back and you do something really bad for the environment, our traditional services will be provided very quickly because you're a treasured partner. And that's an important thing I think the community needs to know. As much, I've talked tonight about we will partner with businesses that are trying to do the right thing, that are trying to create the economy of tomorrow, not the economy of yesterday. And we will do that. If they slip back, if they mess up, particularly if it's big or if they've been negligent or careless, we are the environmental cops and we'll take the action that we need to take. Now, some people find that a difficult concept. I'm not a parent, but when I talk to parents, when I watch parents, very few parents are completely the friendly parent or completely the disciplinarian. You choose the mix over time that suits the circumstances of the behaviour you're trying to generate in your child. And that's the challenge for, I think, a modern regulator. The second example, and what I'll finish on, is actually spent most of the day on, in the leaving catchment. What we would traditionally do is we would go into a part of Scotland and we'd measure the water quality and we'd have this plan called a River Basin Management Plan. If you're ever struggling to go to sleep, read a River Basin Management Plan. They're really important documents for us. They're really helpful. They list, 100 actions to take in rivers and locks in what we call a catchment. But for the general public, they're pretty uninspiring documents. But they've delivered a lot. A lot of the improvements in water qualities come from that. But it's now time in this next phase to move on for the reasons I outlined at the start of the talk. And the team's really pushing hard to try and reinvent for the next phase. We signed a sustainable growth agreement in the Leven catchment, so in Fife, with 9 partners last year. So it was Fife Council, Diageo as a drinks manufacturer, the Forth Rivers Trust, the volunteers who look after the rivers in that area, Keep Scotland Beautiful, the local Fife College. I can go on and on. Another 4 organisations signed up on Earth Day, in the run-up to Earth Overshoot Day. So the Coal Authority, Network Rail that's rebuilding the rail line out to Levenmouth, and a couple of others. So we now have 15 partners working on how do we take what was one of the heartlands of the original high carbon industrial revolution. That's what the wealth in that part of Scotland was built on. This was one of the heartlands of the world's industrial revolution. Lots of those factories have closed and are now disused, and a lot of the river is unattractive and there's poor water quality. But rather than just focusing narrowly on improving water quality, these 15 organisations have got together, and it's absolutely inspiring to hear the way the organisations are working to try and decarbonise that economy, to try and dematerialise it, to try and create the economy and society of tomorrow by working together. Because if I go back to my starting point, an EPA can fix factory pollution by just working with the factory. And that was the right thing to do in phase 1. It will still be the right thing to do many times in phase 2. But 3 planets to 1, or the threat of 2 or 3 degrees warming, or the collapse of biodiversity, are systems problems. And you can't fix 6 systems problems without system solutions. So you can't decarbonise, dematerialise a part of Scotland unless all the partners come together and say this is a collective effort. And it's absolutely amazing what's happening in that area, and is a model for, I think, how an EPA needs to operate. And again, I'll just re-emphasise this point, as part of that effort, we will be doing our traditional work in that part of Scotland, but it'll have much more impact because if we're helping a company that's doing better, lots more people will know about it, they'll get more value from it, other businesses will want to do it. If we're beating up a business that's done the wrong thing, more people will know about it, they'll get more social sanction from it in addition to our penalties, because there is a community that is galvanising around a different future. And while it's a SEPA Sustainable Growth Agreement, we are just really the facilitators of major collaborative effort. So in that half hour or so, what I've tried to do, just to cap that off, is say the first phase of an EPA's work was quite rightly trying to fix very specific pollution problems, mainly from industrial facilities, but also some other sources like runoff from farms. The science tells us that that's not good enough anymore. The science says we have to keep doing that. Indeed, we have to get better at it, do it quicker, more powerfully. And we have to make our contribution, which I'm not overstating. As I say, everybody will have to make a contribution to tackling climate change, biodiversity collapse, etc. But we have to make our contribution to changing the economic and social systems of Scotland, as I think is the same challenge for an EPA anywhere in the world, and is the same, in fact, the same challenge for every society in the world. So, Alison, I'll leave it there, and very happy now to take questions and comments. And I'm particularly interested in your reactions to what I've mapped out, because, as I say, when I have these sort of sessions, I'll always end up thinking better about how we tackle those challenges, what you think makes sense, doesn't make sense, what you think we need to think about. So I look forward to the discussion.